Good afternoon. Today is Saturday, the 25th of February, 2023. We're up here with part of the 7th Corps Desert Storm reunion, and this is Jay Waters with the Voices of Freedom Project, and I'm going to interview with George. George, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Yeah, if you could, just for the record, maybe just state your full name and where you were born and where you live now.
George Baker Thomson, Jr., born in Miami, Florida. Currently, I'm residing in Mukilteo, Washington.
Washington, okay.
The opposite corner.
Excellent. And what branch of service did you serve in?
The Army.
And what conflict or conflicts did you participate in?
Desert Shield, Desert Storm.
Okay. Well, we'll talk some more about that. But going backwards a little bit, did any other family members of yours serve in the military? You know, father or grandparents, anything along those lines?
Yeah, my dad was an anti-aircraft gunner in the Navy in World War II.
Okay. Did you get some good stories over the years from your dad?
No, I got very little from him. He was, I think, pretty traumatized by his experience because he was at both Iwo Jima and Okinawa as an anti-aircraft gunner on a destroyer escort.
Okay. Again, kind of a background question though, but think about September 11th, 2001, you know, the attack on America.
Mm-hmm.
Where were you that day? And just in your own words, tell us, you know, where you were, what was going on in your life, and you know, what happened, so to speak.
I was working for a little telephone company in Melbourne, Florida called Supertel Network. And I'd been retired from the military for 4 years at the time that occurred. So I first heard about the attack when I was pulling up in the parking lot at work.
And what was your reaction, or what was your first thoughts?
I'm not sure I can recollect any instant reaction. At first I just thought it was an errant airplane that had, you know, hit the tallest building in New York. But then when the second airplane hit, you know, and there were all kinds of wild stories. You know, the size of the airplane ranged via these reports from a Cessna to, you know, an airliner. And, but it became pretty clear over the next couple hours that this was an attack, unknown perpetrators, et cetera, et cetera.
And what was it like in the community, either that day or the couple days after? Neighbors or friends? And
I'm trying to recall. At the time, my daughter was about 9. So I think she got sent home from elementary school early that day.
Yeah.
You know, my wife went and picked her up. But as far as reaction from the rest of the community there, I don't recall any specific reaction, you know, just shock and horror at what had occurred, especially after the extent of the loss of life was known.
Yeah. Well, then back to you and your military service. What made you join the Army?
I was frankly concerned a little bit about my father's reliability about paying college tuition. So I applied to go to West Point and it was accepted.
Okay.
So I received an appointment to the academy and began in July of 1972.
Okay, you started, yeah, okay. And then did you graduate?
Graduated in 1976.
Okay, class of 76. And any specialized training? Like, don't you guys from West Point over the summer, you do different things? Anything stand out at your West Point time or training?
I went to flight school my sophomore year summer, which was kind of a rare event because a lot of the reason why folks went to West Point was because they couldn't get into the Air Force Academy or the Naval Academy because their eyes were bad.
Yeah.
So a lot of my classmates wore glasses. I didn't. So it was relatively simple and straightforward for me to go to flight school. We learned to fly a Bell Jet Ranger Army Kiowa helicopter, the kind you see flying around doing news stuff all the time. We would have flown what were called TH-55s, little training helicopters, 2-seaters, but at the time they were completely swamped with South Vietnamese pilots as the war was transitioning over to the ARVN. And those guys had taken up all of the TH-55s available for training, so they moved us up to a turbine-powered helicopter. Well, that may or may not have been a great idea, but it was a fun experience.
Sure.
I got a private pilot's helicopter license, which
Okay.
is a worthless ticket to have because anybody will rent you a Cessna if you're a fixed-wing private pilot for whatever the cost of the gas is and some little fee. Even in 1974, we checked into it, and the cheapest we could find helicopter rental was $600 an hour.
Wow.
At that point. And I can't imagine what it is today,
Yeah.
but needless to say, you really didn't get to exercise your newfound ability to fly.
I have no idea about any of this other than the commercial or private
Right.
pilots. I always think of fixed wing.
I was also the secretary of the honor committee during the 1976 honor scandal involving the class of 1977.
Okay, well, so I don't know much about that. What can you tell us about that?
140 plus cadets in the junior class were accused of cheating on an electrical engineering examination. One professor looked at a couple of papers, I don't know, by happenstance, I think, as I recall, and thought this is strange because a pattern of mistakes had been repeated on the test. And it was I should add that it was a take-home test, which was sort of rare, but people had the option. The professors had the option at the time of sending you back to the barracks with a take-home test or doing it in class or whatever. The electrical engineering department, for whatever reason, had decided to do a take-home test. So I had done something very similar the year before, but this involved the class right below me.
Yeah.
So as secretary of the honor committee, I came back from spring break, and I was on the cadet public relations committee, which meant you got an extra, 72 hours of spring leave because they sent you to some school in your home state, a university usually, or several high schools to try to convince folks to go to West Point.
Sure.
And then I came back, and all I did from whatever time in April I came back until June 2nd when we graduated, well, up till about a week before we graduated, all I did was chair honor boards, which was 3 times a day. There was one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and one after chow in the evening. And they were all related to the same examination. And it was a very big political issue at the time. The Secretary of the Army got involved. There were accusations about who was cheating or whether or not the analysis that the professors had done was accurate, and many of the cadets got defense counsel because there was a law department at West Point, and some of the professors acted as defense counsel for those guys. At a certain point, it was decided that the results of the honor board, well, I should back up. The cadets ran their own honor system, and traditionally at that point at West Point, the officers didn't get involved. The cadets made a decision to expel somebody, or recommended that they be expelled, and of course there was process behind that, but it was never second guessed up to that point. But then there had never been a scandal prior to that except the football team scandal in 1951. So it had been a while since there had been this kind of allegation of widespread cheating at West Point.
Right. Well, how did it all sort out then?
I think out of the 140 or so folks that had been accused, we, the honor committee, believed that 42 or so were guilty and recommended expulsion for them. There was a lot of hue and cry about that. The Secretary of the Army directed that officer boards be held for those cadets who had been recommended for expulsion. And the officers pretty much ratified what the cadets had done after that process got done. There were a lot of questions around whether or not this was going to be a final decision or whether or not there would be an appeals process and a potential ability to get yourself reinstated.
Yeah.
And a couple of the folks from that class were offered readmission and graduated later with a class of 78 or 79.
Okay. And I'm just curious, I don't want to get too bogged into
Sure.
this, but did any of the cadets just say, hey, you know what, I did cheat? And
A couple of guys did, yeah. You know, one of the guys who was one of the original folks who was identified just said, yeah, I did it. I'm not even sure that we had an honor board for him. He voluntarily resigned. You know, and he was a second semester junior. They called him cows at West Point, but he was a second semester junior, and that was a big deal because if you went to class on the first day of your junior year, you incurred an obligation as an enlisted soldier if you didn't graduate.
Yeah.
So you might have to do 4 years as a PFC or Spec for War. So it's a significant emotional event.
Yeah, and I'm sorry we kind of went down a path.
Yeah,
of,
well, okay.
Just for background. But so you graduated with the class of 76? Just tell us
I
about
did.
your commissioning.
I selected Signal Corps as my branch. I went to Fort Gordon for basic signal officers course, and then went to airborne school because I did not go to jump school while I was a cadet, unlike most of my classmates, because I was at flight school at the time.
Yeah.
Went to jump school, and I went to jump school because at the time President Carter was taking all sorts of measures to try to reduce the federal deficit, and the economy was in the tank and all of that. So instead of being offered jump school and ranger school in the ordinary course of business, like almost every other class before us, we had to make a selection about which one of these TDY courses we could go to after graduation. And I had selected Fort Bragg, and I thought, there's no way I'm going to Fort Bragg as a leg ranger. So I went to jump school, which, in retrospect was kind of a stupid decision, uninformed decision, wasn't stupid. Uninformed because I could have gone to ranger school, and I could have done a sort of a charm school course at Fort Bragg almost at any time while I was there. And gotten my wings.
Yeah.
But I had no idea. I was a dumbass cadet.
Yeah.
So I went through the basic course with the Signal Corps. I went to Fort Bragg. I was assigned to the 35th Signal Brigade in the 426th Signal Battalion. Started off my career as a cable construction platoon leader. Went through the various platoons in Company D, 426th Signal Battalion. Next was the microwave radio platoon. The next after that was the access radio platoon, which was the UHF platoon. And then there was the comm center platoon, which was basically secure teletypes. But it was a data center, an early form of a data center.
Sure.
So, and the comm center platoon leader was also the Company XO. After that, I was a battalion adjutant, and then got selected for command as a first lieutenant with about 3 months' time in grade, and went back to Command D Company, 426 Signal Battalion.
Okay.
So that was my command tour at Fort Bragg in 1978, 1979. Then I was selected for the Signal Advance course, went to the Signal Advance course, and I had received orders at the end of my command tour after, I don't think I took leave for the 12 months I was in command. I was a nervous first lieutenant, and Fort Bragg had a system at the time of unannounced IG inspections. So that was a real significant emotional event when the IG called at 0600 and said, we'll be there at 0730. That was a career buster if you didn't pass the IG inspection. Now, the standards were not perfection. The standards were, is this unit ready to go to combat? So in that sense, it was a more realistic IG inspection, but it was still nerve-wracking.
Sure.
And
Sure.
I'm sure my blood pressure was off the charts as a 24-year-old.
Yeah.
But passed the inspection, and then I finally went on a week leave after we passed the IG, and that happened to coincide. My tour in command was almost January to January, so it was roughly the whole year. And this leave I was describing happened at Thanksgiving.
Okay.
So I left at Thanksgiving, and I talked to the assignments officer at Signal Branch and said, look, I took 4 years at German at West Point. I don't want to lose that capability. I had tested out at like the intermediate level in German. 60% of the Army at the time was in Germany. I said, send me to Germany. He's like, oh, yeah, no problem. So I get back from this Thanksgiving leave, and my first sergeant calls me, and I go, what's up, Top? He goes, sir, I think you got your orders, and he hands me an envelope. I open it up, and it's orders to Korea. So I'm like, what? So I was a little bit frustrated, and I end up going down to Fort Gordon for the Signal Officer Advanced course, and in the interim there, I had, because I'd been the battalion adjutant, I had way more familiarity with the Army regulations than one should have at that age and level of experience in the Army. But I had stumbled over something called the Funded Legal Education Program. And at the time, I was married. I didn't want to do an unaccompanied tour in Korea. And I think there were some other considerations in there because I was at year 4 of my 5-year obligation to the Army as a result of graduating from West Point. And I'm sure they said, well, this guy could be on the fence about leaving. We'll squeeze a year of utilization out of him. So, there were many thoughts running through my head. I called up a buddy of mine who had also gone to Korea before me and said, hey, I got this assignment as an assistant S1 for the Signal Brigade the Signal Battalion for the 2nd ID. Mm-hmm. And what can you tell me about this? And he called me back and goes, oh man, this is one of those deals where you go to division headquarters at 0200 and they lock a briefcase of classified information onto your wrist. You get in an open Jeep with a driver and you go down to Seoul, you hand that briefcase off and pick up another one and come back. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So I got hot on putting in an application to the Funded Legal Education Program, and my backup was to go to flight school because I knew I was physically qualified to go to flight school because I'd done that as a cadet. And they didn't want to lose the benefit of the training that they'd already given the folks. I think there were 50 or so of us that went to flight school that summer. They didn't want to lose that training, so it was kind of an automatic ticket.
Right.
So I'm explaining this to the assignments guy who comes down to the advanced course and is talking to all the captains about how what their next assignment's going to be. And I knew this guy because he was a guy named John Wakelin, 05, and he'd been the battalion commander of the battalion next door, Signal Battalion next door to mine. He'd graded me on an RTEP. So I had a relationship with the guy. And I went in and I said, sir, I'm not going to be available for Korea. And he's like, look, Lieutenant, I was still lieutenant at the time. He said, look, Lieutenant, you're going to Korea. You might as well make peace with that and go and do the best job you can do. I said, sir, I'm going to be a glorified messenger, freezing my ass off in a open-top Jeep, driving between Seoul and the DMZ on a daily basis. That doesn't really sound like a fulfilling assignment for somebody that's had a successful command tour. And the typical reaction occurred right then, which was, you need to come to the position of attention and move out smartly. Yeah. And I was like, okay, I'm just telling you, this may be a problem for you because I have an application in for the Funded Legal Education Program. He goes, nobody in the Signal Corps has ever gotten into that program. You need to just forget about that crap. Needless to say, 3 or 4 weeks later, 3 of us in the advanced course that year got selected for the FLEP program.
Yeah, congratulations.
So I went in and he was livid. Yeah. He came back for another visit to actually cement.
You gave him a heads up.
Right.
You tried to do the right thing.
He wanted to cement everybody's assignment, and now he had to go tell somebody the bad news that they were going to go to Korea on an unaccompanied tour for a year while Thomson went to law school and screwed around for 3 years.
Yeah. Where did you end up going to law school?
Went to Stetson University School of Law in St. Petersburg, Florida, because they wanted you to go in-state, your home of record state, if that was going to give you some kind of a tuition advantage. Now, Stetson's a private school, but they did have a tuition break for Florida residents. And as well, that the selection board for the FLEP program met late that year, and I didn't get notified until late April. And when you're trying to apply to law school, and all your contemporaries had already applied and gotten admitted because, they didn't have to wait for a selection board.
Right.
My options were limited. I got into the University of Florida, but they said you can't start in September. You got to start in January because we've already filled that class. We'd love to have you, but anyway, the JAG course said no. You got to start in the school year, and you got to go through in 3 years. So that's not an option. I said okay, fine. So I went to Stetson. I should add, my dad was a Florida lawyer as well.
Okay.
And so, I didn't want to go to the University of Miami because he had gone there, and my parents and my in-laws both lived in Miami, and I wasn't really overjoyed about going back to Miami to be overseen by both sets of parents at the time.
Well, if we could then, and this is all great, but I want to kind of fast forward a little bit to maybe around 1989-90 when you ended up either with 7th Corps or near 7th Corps, kind of set the stage for then the Desert Storm part of your career.
Great question. I went to the JAG basic course and then got an assignment at Fort Knox, was a senior defense counsel at Fort Knox for 3 years. Great assignment. I had 4 or 5 defense counsel working for me. One of them worked at Fort Ben Harrison, the others worked at Fort Knox, and I would say in 2.5 years I probably tried 150 cases, which is the kind of invaluable experience for a litigator that you just don't get unless you're in a public defender's office or the state attorney's office as a prosecutor. It's just, it's invaluable. Anyway, after that assignment, I was assigned to the JAG career course, which is called the graduate course, but it's just the JAG Corps advanced course. But it's a year-long course.
Yeah, that's down in Charlottesville.
In Charlottesville, Virginia, at the University of Virginia. The outcome is you get a master's in law, which is an advanced degree beyond a JD. But it was a nice thing to have. I mean, it's specifically designed for military attorneys. So coming out of there, I was finally assigned to Germany.
Yeah, your German speaking skills.
Right. 11 years later, I get assigned to Germany and end up as a staff officer at headquarters USAR, U.S. Army Europe, in 7th Army, in the Judge Advocate's office. And I was in the International Law Division. So for 2 years, I worked on the USAR staff as the International Law Division guy, which meant that I was instantly an expert, and I say that with air quotes, on international law, including the Geneva Conventions of 1949, the law of war, the law of protecting civilians during the war, and all the considerations around carrying on armed conflict in accordance with the conventions. So after that, I was assigned, the next step in a JAG career is you get assigned as the officer in charge of a specific legal office. I was in the 7th Corps. I was then assigned, after the USAR tour, to 7th Corps officer in charge, Munich Law Office. That's a tough assignment to go to Munich to begin with as a single guy. And I had the communities of Munich, Bad Aibling, Bad Tolz, Oberammergau, if you can imagine, Garmisch-Partenkirchen, and Berchtesgaden. So tough duty again. But I did it all. I mean, I had a German attorney working for me. I had a U.S. civilian attorney. I had a captain. I was a major at the time. Had a captain. I had, all told, probably 18, 20 U.S. and local national civilians working in the office, doing the entire gamut of things that you do in a Army law office: legal assistance, criminal law, administrative law, command advice to the 1-star who was the community commander / AFIS commander. And I did a lot of contract law, which was unusual for people doing an OIC job because the Armed Forces Recreation Centers were also headquartered in Munich. Well, no, they weren't headquartered. They were headquartered in Garmisch. But since I was down in Garmisch weekly, I did a lot of contract review for them and a lot of legal assistance for the folks that work for Armed Forces Recreation Center. So yes, I had to go to Chiemsee and visit that place and make sure the hotel was running correctly. Sure. Same way with Berchtesgaden, and you get all kinds of crazy. And Munich at the time was an intelligence hub. Yeah. The 66 MI Brigade was there, and first time I was required to get a TS SCI clearance because my clients couldn't really come and talk to me a lot unless I had the appropriate clearances. Yeah. And you know, I hope your branch wasn't MI because I'm going to say some stuff about the military. Yeah, I'm going to say some stuff about the military intelligence guys. You know, they guard the nation's secrets zealously, but there are folks who feel that within the confines of an attorney-client relationship, they can disclose stuff that Thomson should not know.
Yeah, okay.
And so I would go see the battalion commander on some routine Article 15 business, and before I know it, I'm in the XO's office. Fortunately, the battalion commander was a great guy, but you know, a little loose with some information that should not be trifled with. Yeah. His XO was a really high-speed major, and she ended up as a 2-star, Barb Fast, in the military intelligence. But anyway, Barb would grab me as I came out of the commander's office, and there's that document you sign that you won't reveal any secrets that you inadvertently learn. I probably signed 500 of those every time I went to see the colonel. You know, I'm going to Barb's office.
Maybe they felt like you were the priest and the confessor and the lawyer.
Well, they knew it was an attorney-client relationship. So, you know, to the extent they said anything about a 3-letter agency that worked closely with the 66 MI Brigade, or you know, some compartmentalized information about operations that were going on in Munich or weren't going on in Munich, or Bad Aibling, which was a listening post. You know, they had one of those elephant cages that was a huge antenna array that listened to what was going on out east. In any event, I was doing that job, and I got a call from Walt Huffman, who was my boss. And Walt was the SJA for 7th Corps, another high-speed guy and a wonderful human being. And Walt called me up and asked me if I could come up to Stuttgart. And this is in, I want to say, mid-October of 1990. I should also mention that I'd gotten married about...
This is October of 90, so Iraq is already invaded.
Right. Okay. 18th Airborne Corps is already either there or on the way, but you know, they're kind of there as a speed bump until the rest of it. So, you know, I sort of kind of knew that they weren't going to be able to do whatever it is they needed to do to oust Saddam from Kuwait with the 18th Airborne Corps. You know, it just wasn't a sufficient amount of combat power. And it wasn't hard to guess where the Armored Corps was going to come from, because Texas is a long way away, and Germany is closer. Sure. You know, and it had good ports, and they were good allies, and were willing to help. So I got called up there. I brought my wife of 4 or 5 weeks, whatever it was. I got married in mid-September, so I'm there. And Walt specifically said, bring Cheryl with you. Cheryl's my wife. And I said, okay, fine. You know, so you're going to stay with me at my quarters. Great, sir, I'll be there. You know, whatever time we had agreed on. So I drive up there, and I find out that I'm going to be the OSJA 7th Corps Advance Party. Me and Master Sergeant Al Williams. Well, at the time he was an E7, but he ended up being a Master Sergeant.
And what was your rank at this
time? I was a major.
Major, okay.
I had been promoted to major in 1989 after 9.5 years as a captain. That's another story. The JAG Corps took over its own personnel management. They got their nose out of joint because they were on the regular list, and they felt that they'd been shafted a little bit on the percentage of promotion from captain to major 1 year. So they took over their own management, and as good lawyers, they screwed it all up, and produced a bubble that really embarrassed all of my classmates from the class of '76 who had gone through the same process I did to get in the JAG clerk.
They tell you you're part of the advanced party, you're getting ready to deploy.
You bet.
Yep. And
You
you're
bet.
major, you got a small team. Okay.
I got a small team.
So kind of tell us about that. How did you physically get to, I'm assuming, Saudi Arabia first?
Yeah, we collected all the documents we needed, and I think we ended up with about 8 Foot Lockers worth of books, because back in the day, I had a primitive laptop that was brand new, untested. I mean, this thing was as big as a bread box, and we were taking it, but we didn't know much, but we knew at least that the conditions in the desert weren't going to be favorable for primitive laptops. So we took a full set of the Army regulations. I took what's called the Pictet's Commentaries on the Geneva Conventions of 1949, which is a 4-volume set of books about that big. The Uniform Code of Military Justice, the Manual for Courts Martial. So eventually 8 Foot Lockers worth of this stuff got packed, and we drove up to Rhine-Main, got on a C-5 with all kinds of cats and dogs who were constituting the 7th Corps Advance Party, and flew to Dhahran. Stayed at Dhahran Airfield in a GP medium that had been set up on a set of tennis courts, and there was an office building right next to, well, it wasn't an office building, it was an auditorium where I think they showed movies for the Saudis back in the day. And so they turned it over to us, and we just kind of camped out in little spots in this building, and then the briefings would happen from the stage twice daily. And we worked there to try to prepare ourselves for the reception of the main party. And our other main job was to go to the port of Dhahran, Dammam, when the ships, the Ro-Ros came in, and meet the units in the warehouses where they were going to stay for 72, 96 hours, and give them 1-hour instruction on the law of armed conflict. Don't shoot prisoners, you have to treat them well, you have to make sure they get fed and protected, the basic blocking and tackling of complying with the law of war. So did that. The main party came down mid-December, and then we moved out to the desert from Dhahran to a place, I think that was Tactical Assembly Area Thomson with a P.
No relation to you.
No relation to me. These names, I'm not sure where the names for the TAAs came from. Yeah, I'm sure they did. Anyway.
But now I'm assuming like the Corps Colonel, the SJA, and the full team.
Exactly. Walt has come down. Everybody that it was going to deploy had come down from the Corps JAG office. I mean, there were folks that were staying by. Walt's deputy was staying behind to do the rear area things that needed to get done. But we probably took at least 2/3 of the JAG office. I mean, we knew that what was going to happen back in the rear was essentially legal assistance. And there was not going to be any command advice, any criminal law going on back there, or any administrative advice about anything, because it was all going to be downrange.
Right.
So we got out to the desert, and we were assigned a GP medium, a number of GP mediums for all the troops to be in. Established our slice of the perimeter, and started doing very routine things that one would do in combat, which was post the guard every night. I was a sergeant of the guard. We had 3 majors in my tent. We were all 3 sergeants of the guard, and we took 3 shifts every night. And we'd take the guard, these are captains, and there were a few enlisted folks that were with us. There were a couple of court reporters and a couple of legal clerks, but mainly the folks sitting out in a foxhole on the perimeter from stand 2 until whenever, or all night when we were maintaining an all-night guard, were captain lawyers, who were out there with their whatever their weapons were. I guess they had M16s. Sure. I had a 45.
But in your tactical assembly area, there were
right.
the G1.
Absolutely. We had a pie slice, and every other group, the AG had one, and PAO, and whomever else was out there. So
yeah. So before the ground war started, though, in addition to that, what kind of things were you doing on a day-to-day basis?
I was doing things like writing the rules of engagement for the Corps. And I was a trusted courier, so I would often end up going from the tactical assembly area to Riyadh to deliver our draft rules of engagement to both 3rd Army headquarters, the JAG, and to Ray Rupert, who was the CENTCOM JAG at the time, to get signed off and make sure those guys were okay with it. So I did several trips like that, and went, much further in the way of exploring Saudi Arabia than most of my contemporaries, because I was also, as an extra duty, as assigned a contracting officer with a warrant for $5,000. So I could go to the local souk and buy things that were needed for the Corps rear headquarters.
Right.
At one point, the Corps rear, we didn't have any heat because we had given up all of our old diesel heaters that were generally assigned to a GP medium to the East German refugees, and a lot of our tonnage had been given to the East German refugees as well, to handle them as they came across the border, as it became more and more porous, and then right after the wall came down, as chaos reigned and everybody decided, well, I'll just drive west and see whether life would be better there, because I've been watching pirated TV and I know what's going on over there. It's great, I'm going to go. So they got in their Trabies and they all drove west. Anyway, we didn't have as much equipment as we should have for basic troop living. So one of my duties on one of my trips, I went out to the souk and bought 150 kerosene heaters,
because
space heaters.
A test for the interview, Saudi Arabia in December and January was pretty darn cold.
It was freezing cold, and it rained hard. The desert floods. Grass grows for about 2 or 3 weeks. Every Bedouin in the entire area goes with their flocks to the grass. And the Iraqis were aware of all these seasonal changes and used a lot of white Toyota 4x4 pickup trucks, which had been issued to all the Bedouins so they could, in their nomadic wandering, they could do something a little more modern than go by foot. And they could transport sick animals in these things. And it was also the Saudi government's way of rewarding folks with the oil largesse. Like people in Alaska used to get a check, or maybe they still do, I don't know. But they used to get a check from oil revenue. The same way in Saudi Arabia, generally, the citizens got some kind of share payout annually, and sometimes it might be in the form of a white Toyota 4x4 pickup truck.
Well, so then how about when the ground war kicked off, how did things change for you, or did they change?
They changed a lot. I had established my operation. We had, as things rolled into the country, we got a trailer that we could use as an office. I got access to what I needed to do things for General Franks in the way of publishing general orders, general order number 1, no alcohol, and a series of general orders after that, talking about things like war souvenirs. What was an authorized thing for a GI to have, and what was strictly verboten. Yeah. You couldn't go into a civilian's place of residence and rip them off. But, for instance, they found a warehouse full of Iraqi bayonets. They said, what can we do with these? They said, well, those are legitimate trophies of war. If you want to hand out bayonets to the lucky soldiers who want a souvenir, it's fine. And that was done. There were a lot of questions about guys who were operating in Kuwait who were given gifts by the Kuwaitis who were very, very appreciative.
Right.
I remember one guy was a special forces captain. He calls me up and says, "This guy wants to give me an Evinrude outboard motor." I'm like, no. I mean, seriously, no. You may not take an Evinrude outboard motor home to put on your bass boat because Sheikh so-and-so was really grateful that you did stuff for him. And I was the chief of administrative, civil, and operational law. That was my actual title. And as such, I did a lot of things other than law of war advice, although that was my primary job. I was in charge of claims. So, troops do a lot of damage as they move through areas, and people would come and make claims. We had a camo claim. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the gradations of camel, from the highest to the lowest. And don't ever kill a racing camel is my advice. Those things are valuable, or relatively valuable. We had some reservist who was a veterinarian who found some flock of sheep that was special. They were desert-going sheep who could handle long stretches without water, and he wanted to send 2 to the National Zoo here. And I'm like, look, I don't care. I don't think you're trying to profit by this, but how physically are you going to transport them? Oh, I got somebody in the Air Force to agree to put them on a C-141 and fly them to D.C. I'm like, sure. Whatever you do, if you get some kind of bill of sale from the Bedouin person who owns these sheep, and they had been gifted by the guy because he was very happy that the Iraqis weren't grabbing him and his family and forcing them to do things like turn over his flock to the army so they could eat.
Sure.
But we had weird questions. An engineer battalion from the 18th Airborne Corps had pulled into a cement factory. And as enterprising engineers, they decided to build themselves a high-speed berm out of concrete, which they proceeded to do. But apparently it was about $2 million worth of concrete. And the Saudi owner of the concrete, or the cement plant, had gone to Geneva, like many rich or well-off Saudis had done prior to the start of the war, and came back and was livid because $2 million worth of cement had been used to build this ring around his cement factory. And he wanted $2 million. So fortunately, the battalion was from the 101st, and I was able to transfer that claim analysis to the 18th Airborne Corps JAG office. All my friends at the 18th Airborne Corps JAG office, because JAG Corps is a very small, relatively small branch, and most people know each other. And
it sounds like you were very busy, but one of the questions I like to ask is on what little free time that you might have had, how did you spend that time, and were you able to stay in contact with your wife or other loved ones back either in Germany or back in the States?
I might have gotten 3 or 4 phone calls through that whole time. I tried to send an email very close to the end of the war because there was allegedly a way to do that from King Khalid Military City. I was never successful in being able to send an email. So I think I was able to call my wife 3 or 4 times. That's the sum total. Free time, I had none. 2 days before the ground war started, I got pulled aside by Walt Huffman, and he said, look, General Daniel, who is the Deputy Corps Commander at the time, 2-star, is assembling a special squad to go north so he can be at the breach site or around the breach site somewhere so that he can help direct traffic, food, fuel, and ammunition forward and bring back casualties, EPW, and wrecked vehicles back to be repaired. That's a function of the rear headquarters, logistics in combat. So, among other things that General Daniel wanted in this motley group of folks was a lawyer. So again, Al Williams and I got in our trusty deuce and a half and went forward a couple of days before the war started. I watched the first ID and the first Cav come through the breach because I was beyond the minefield. I don't know how we maneuvered through the minefield. I trust that the guy who led us through there, who was a lieutenant colonel from the Alabama National Guard, as I recall, who had an expando van, headquarters type of van that you might have if you're a battalion commander in the field. That was basically what his unit did. They established kind of a tactical headquarters out of one of these vans. So we went out and we went forward and we pulled up into an old artillery berm site where folks would come in, they'd fire a mission, then they'd move and go to the next area. But these were well into Iraq. They weren't back there. So obviously somebody had found a way through the minefield or some path through the minefield because units had been going up there. I mean, I wasn't really concerned that we were going to roll over an anti-armor mine. Maybe a little, but I was relatively okay with that concept. But we got up there, and briefings had indicated that it was going to take us about 90 days to move through the phase lines to get to Kuwait. That was the expectation. And so that was going to be what I did during the war. Well, I think that expedition was about 5 or 6 days total, and then combat was over. So we turned around and went back the way we came, and we were in Hafr al-Batin. Finally, we had moved out of the tactical assembly area and gotten to a little more luxurious site. This is the site with the trailer.
Yeah.
And it was at Hafr al-Batin. And then we came back to Hafr al-Batin, and then we all moved the entire Corps JAG, Corps Main and Corps Rear, ended up at King Khalid Military City to sort of wait for redeployment, sort out everything, get into a barracks type situation where you had showers and chow and
I guess just
more regular stuff.
Questions when you went forward for that period of time, were you either seeing any actual Iraqi soldiers or surrendering soldiers or debris from where they had been? What kind of things did you see?
We saw a lot of bunkers with dead Iraqi soldiers in them and would not mark them, we would note where they were in case they had not been reported. Because we had a relationship with the Graves registration folks and would say, hey, we think there are approximately 10 guys in this bunker and it's at this grid coordinate.
But this was Iraqi?
Iraqi guys, yeah, not U.S. soldiers. Saw a lot of Iraqi prisoners. I mean, because I would periodically visit some of the EPW. We didn't have camps. We had holding areas because we had decided that we were going to turn over the Iraqi prisoners who had no intelligence value immediately to their Saudi brethren, because Saudis were signatories to the conventions. They were Muslims. They knew how to accommodate the Iraqis, and they were happy to do so.
Well, they spoke the same language.
Exactly. So there was no language barrier. They got them. We would feed them, and they kind of got it down to a science. We would issue them expired chem suits, the impregnated charcoal suits, because they had no winter clothing.
Yeah, it was cold.
Yeah, it was damn cold. And so we'd put them in a chem suit, we'd give them a can of sardines, a sleeve of saltines, and some packets of peanut butter, the MRE, squeeze them out, packets of peanut butter, just to get them some protein, because they were mostly starving.
Yeah.
And water, liter bottles, those ubiquitous cases of liter bottles of water. I did get a little recreational time once we got back to King Khalid Military City. I would go running most days at noon with some women from the JAG office who were also runners, but they felt uncomfortable going out alone because there were a lot of Saudi troops who would openly harass the female soldiers.
Yeah.
In fact, my chief of claims, who was a captain, went out one time she went out to talk to the guy who owned the cement plant. So she's trying to get information. Right. Back to the story. Right. She's trying to get information about that. And in the midst of all this, the owner of the cement plant offered to buy her. She took a translator with her, and the translator's like, I don't know how to say this, man, but this guy wants to purchase you and make you one of his wives. And she was suitably horrified, but I guess it probably made a great war story.
That is a good story.
Yeah. So anyway, we were doing things like that, and once we got to KKMC, we were sorting out things like board GIs who shot a camel. Then I learned all the camel worth statistics that I needed to know, and it was quite an experience.
So you said you deployed with the advanced party. How did it work for the redeployment for you?
I was selected to go back first with Master Sergeant Al Williams because
First out.
Walt thought that was only equitable. So I went home mid to late April.
Okay, well, so still kind of late though. I guess the ground war was now over.
Yeah, but I was the first person from the JAG office to go back. And I ended up we flew into Stuttgart and then had a little ceremony. My wife.
Tell us about the ceremony. What was that like?
Well, it was the first because we were part of the first deployment coming back from Corps. So, they had the band there, but of course they beat us with sticks before we actually got to the gym where they were holding the ceremony. We got off the plane, and then there was some kind of a customs inspection with MPs and dogs, who wandered around sniffing the foot lockers and would ask people randomly to open their duffel bag and,
Sure.
Do you have an AK-47 in there or any of that, those sorts of routine things. So that took, 90 minutes, and you can see the tension ratcheting up because the troops just want to see their family,
You're so close.
Right. You're right there. You're going to drive 5 minutes over there to the gym. You can smell it. You can hear the band practicing out there. So we got off the bus. We marched into the gym. There was a thankfully brief welcome from the rear garrison commander, and then we got released, and I drove home to Munich with my wife that night.
Yeah. And then did you get 4 days of leave and back to work, or what did they do with you after that? Do you remember?
I'm trying to recall if no one was there as a boss because Walt was still in.
You were the boss.
Yeah, I was the boss, and I was the officer in charge in Munich. So I was the highest ranking JAG. So to whatever extent I wanted to take a day or two off, I may have, but I don't recall taking a leave. I may have gone to Berchtesgaden. But that would have been just part of the routine. I would have taken an extended long weekend.
And then later on, when the rest of 7th Corps came back, was there a big ceremony as well?
I don't recall
Don't recall.
having one.
And did you receive a wartime award, just for the record?
I did.
What'd you get?
Every year there's a JAG prom. Well, we called it the JAG prom. I don't know what the official title is, but it was a formal dinner, sort of a dining in, but with spouses. And all the JAGs would go there. And it always happened in late May or June. And so it happened to coincide with all the rest of the folks from the main party had come back. And so we were going to go to Heidelberg and have the JAG prom. And I remember going to the prom. I had gotten no award or no citation or no anything. And Walt Huffman caught me at the lobby of the Heidelberg Officers Club and pressed a Bronze Star and whatever the presidential unit citation thing that went on the other side of your uniform into my hand and said, "Go in the latrine and put these on your uniform." And I'm like, "Okay, sir, no problem." Yeah. So that's how I was awarded my Bronze Star at the officers' mess in Heidelberg, Germany.
Well, then without all the details, but you went on to the rest of you had a longer career after this, right? This was just
Right. Munich was on the BRAC list for closure because 7th Corps was going to be decommissioned, and Munich was one of the 7th Corps communities. So generally, all the communities in 7th Corps ended up shutting down, except places like Stuttgart, which also had EUCOM headquarters, so they were going to have a continuing mission. But all the communities that I loved in southern Bavaria were eventually turned back over to the Germans. So I worked on that BRAC process until the end of 1990, well, no, not the end, the summer of 1992, and I was selected to go to residential Command and General Staff College. So I went to Leavenworth for a year, which is a big deal in the JAG Corps because they don't send anybody to CGSC. Well, they don't send anybody. That's wrong. They do send a select few folks, and they're way senior to the classmates. So we all ended up as the section leaders or the group leader, the big group leader. And you're a major or lieutenant colonel with a bunch of high-speed captains who are wondering, well, what the heck this lawyer's doing with him, and why is this guy getting an A in, combined arms operation tests when I can only get a C?
yeah.
So I went there to CGSC for that year. In 93 to 95, I was assigned to SINCPAC as the Army JAG in the Joint Command there.
But did you get promoted? When you eventually?
I was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1994, and then in 1995 I got selected to be the chief of international and operational law in the same office at headquarters USER that I'd been in when I was a captain as a staff officer in the international law division. So I was one of the 05 division chiefs in the JAG office at USER, and then I was tentatively selected as the 1st Armored Division SJA, and did not end up taking that position because my wife wanted to stay in Heidelberg. Her dad was a Canadian Air Force pilot who was assigned to the NATO staff, and her parents were there. We had a 4-year-old. She was interested in continuity for the kid, wanted to keep her in the preschool program or the daycare, whatever she was in. It was academic, so it was preschool. Wanted to keep her there, wanted to stay in the house, and didn't want to move to, where was it? Bad Kreuznach. Didn't want to move to Bad Kreuznach until I came back from Bosnia, which is where I was told I was going to go 2 months after I ended up in 1st Armored Division because they were going downrange. I did a lot of preliminary work for that as the chief of international law because I got yanked down to go to the embassy and negotiate a acquisition and cross-servicing agreement with the Hungarians so that we could base our forces in Kaposvar, which is an old Soviet Air Force base down there, and then stage them to go cross the river and go into Bosnia and perform the peacekeeping mission. That was another interesting tale, but that's a long story too.
We may have to hold that one.
Yeah. Anyway, I proposed this to the JAG Corps that I go to Bosnia, my wife could stay in Heidelberg, and they were concerned that she would not then be fulfilling the duties of Mrs. SJA for the captains and majors' wives of the JAG office in Bad Kreuznach, which was true. So I notified them that I was going to retire and said, however, I will accept an assignment to CENTCOM because I was one of the few JAGs that had the appropriate level clearances, and I'd been right on to special programs, and I could be cleared for anything that CENTCOM was doing, which was, like a 9-month advantage in time, because anybody else that got selected that didn't have those tickets were going to have to go through the background investigation, and at the time they were taking 8 to 9 months. And that was accepted favorably, and they called me back and said, we're going to send a high-speed major to do that job, and we'd like you to go to Fort Gillem, Georgia. Plus, I wanted to go back to Florida. I was a Florida lawyer, and I thought, I can work out my transition from the military back to civilian life, and CENTCOM's in Tampa, and I went to law school in St. Petersburg, which is right across the bay. So I had a lot of contacts. It would have been a really an element of synchronicity as far as I was concerned personally.
Sure.
You know, and the Army doesn't care that much about your personal wants and desires. So when I got the assignment to Fort Gillem, I said, nah, I'm just going to pull the plug and retire.
So when did you retire?
1997, September 1997.
97. So 1976 to 1997.
Mm-hmm.
What was that, 20?
21 plus years.
Yeah. Well, then, what'd you do after you retired? What was it? The short version.
Short version is I got a job with a boutique litigation firm in Tallahassee, Florida. I moved to Tallahassee for a year, and then my West Point roommate, who had gotten out of the Army after 5 years but had stayed in telecommunications, had been named the president of a competitive local telephone company in the Southeast called NextLink. It's now XO Communications. But he called me up and said, you know, why don't you come down here and be my lawyer and also the VP of HR? And I'm like, you know, I don't think you can afford me. You know, I'm up here at the law firm making the big bucks. And he named a figure which was about $25K more than I was making at the law firm.
Okay.
And I thought, well, you know, maybe this would be a good thing because I'd be going back into the Signal Corps, something I was familiar with from a technical and an engineering standpoint, which is an advantage. I didn't know this. I wasn't clever enough or prescient enough to understand that until I got back into the industry and realized, you know, I know how these boxes fit together and the cables transmit signals between the boxes. I'm not a guy that could design the inside of the box, but I can design the system.
Yeah,
because that's what that's right. That's exactly what it is. You know, and it doesn't matter what kind of cable it is. It was copper cable when I was in the Signal Corps. It's fiber optic cable now. It does the same stuff. You know, it's a black sheathed way to transmit communications from A to B. And I've been in a role as a legal advisor to telephone companies since then, except for 18 months as a deputy cabinet officer in Colorado. I was the senior director of enforcement for the Colorado Department of Revenue, in which position I regulated auto sales and auto agency licensing, which meant that, you know, I made sure that the felons couldn't sell used cars to folks.
Yeah.
I regulated liquor, tobacco, casino gambling, horse racing and dog racing, and at the time, medical marijuana.
Okay.
Had 150 cops working for me.
It was one of the first.
It was the first, yeah.
Well, so kind of tying everything back together, how do you think your military service in general, but specifically your wartime service, affected you for everything else that you've done since and are doing now?
Affected me, you know, it's really an interesting aspect of my career that most people just never had the opportunity to experience. So it's, you know, it's cocktail party conversation fun. Did it do something that is lifelong impacting? Only in the sense that I probably got gassed. You know I got oil, fire, smoke, contamination, because I remember going out and making sure that I pulled my underwear off the drying line so it didn't turn black when the oil smoke came through. I fell in a hole that the engineers had dug as a trench one night when I was going out to the perimeter. I dropped about 12 feet. You know, I stepped off into space. I imagine that's why I have a titanium hip now. But beyond the sorts of VA disability claim things, it was a positive experience in that I got to know folks that were real superstars as lawyers and as soldiers. Walt Huffman ended up as the Judge Advocate General of the Army.
Yeah.
And several of the other folks in my orbit, John Altenberg, ended up as the Assistant Judge Advocate General of the Army. And John was frequently a visitor at our tent. At the time he was the SJA for the 1st Armored Division, but he would come down to talk to Walt as the Corps SJA and do things like bring his rules of engagement to Walt and say, "We need your sign off on this." I was the guy who wrote all the Law of War rules of engagement cards for the troops. We found a printer who could make playing card sized cards with the rules of engagement on it, so the soldiers could keep them in their BDU pockets. Right.
Well, the second to last question is kind of thinking about it. There's one thing that you would want, kids, grandkids, future generations, or just future generations of Americans. What would you want them to know about you and your wartime service?
I'm not certain that fighting for oil was really something that we ought to be super proud of. Because as I think about it from the perspective of 32 years, that's really what this was all about. There was a natural resource that was critical to U.S. security. There's no doubt about that. At the time, these fossil fuels were critical to U.S. national security. I get that, but when you think about it, at the end of the day, we fought a war to preserve our access to petroleum. And that's kind of what I tell my kids, and they seem to have that kind of view of what happened in Desert Storm. I'm not sure. It was no glorious World War II. We're fighting for principles. We were fighting for resources. And or protecting resources, defending resources. You can think about it either way, but that's...
You're right, it's 32 years ago today.
That's right. That's pretty much the way I think about it today, and I've thought about it pretty much that way ever since I got home. I mean, I thought while we were there,
That's what brought us together now for this reunion 32 years later.
That's right. I thought it was ironic that the oil smoke would come and cover us, not daily, but, weekly.
Yeah.
And... I thought it was ironic that that's what we were fighting for, and that's what we were breathing.
Well, then, so the proverbial last question is really the last question. Is there anything else you'd like to say for the record while we got you
here? No, I don't have any just distilled wisdom to lay on to people about this experience, except that can be a positive experience. You can look back and think about, look, I made things in my little sphere of influence happen that other people couldn't make happen. And I did things that I was proud of, particularly in the way that we conformed our combat conduct to the law of armed conflict. We never, as far as I was aware, abused enemy prisoners of war. We never exploited them for propaganda value during the war, although there were those who thought that we ought to be videoing everything that happened in the life of an EPW so that we could show that we were doing that. There's one little problem with that. The conventions strictly prohibit the use of EPWs for propaganda reasons. And, at the end of the day, that's a propaganda reason. We wanted to show that we were conforming our conduct to the law of war. We did that, but we weren't allowed to do that as a reality TV show, which is what people wanted to produce. So to that extent, I'm proud of the fact that we were able to make sure that there were no war crimes. Well, that's a strong statement. There were no real crimes against humanity committed by the 7th Corps during our offensive operations, or during our entire operation in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait and in Iraq.
Well, good. We covered a lot of ground. Very interesting afternoon.
Good.